I love this time of year. It's a time of resurrection, not only in the church, but in all of God's creation. Flowers blooming, trees leafing, newborn calves frolicking, tiny birds pecking their way out of the shell, fledglings trying to learn to fly. The migration of butterflies and birds, the sprouting of seeds from the fertile earth, the warmth of the sun on our face and the lengthening of days. The natural world is constantly being born and reborn. Signs of resurrection are everywhere. But sometimes resurrection is hard, and it is hard to see. The biblical story of Thomas is found only in the Gospel of John. By the time of the writing of John's Gospel, some 70 years or more after the death of Jesus, Jewish and Gentile Christians were experiencing tremendous persecution from the Romans. It was a time where it was difficult to see resurrection anywhere, and life was difficult everywhere. Thomas was not asking for any more evidence of resurrection than the other disciples of Jesus. John's gospel tells us that Thomas was not with the disciples on that Easter Sunday evening when Jesus appeared to them. The others saw, believed. Thomas was not buying any of it. Notice how Jesus responds to Thomas. He doesn't rebuke Thomas. He doesn't chastise him. He gives Thomas what Thomas needs. Jesus invites Thomas to touch and see for himself. In our reading from the book of Acts of the Apostles, we hear that the young church is finding power in Jesus' resurrection by sharing with one another all that they had as they ministered to the hungry, the thirsty, the sick, the homeless, the imprisoned, the downtrodden. Through the power of the Spirit, the resurrected Christ was with the early church, and the writer of Acts says, "Great grace was upon all." The psalmist proclaims today, how very good and pleasant it is when kindred live together in unity. A sign of resurrection when we choose to love and live in harmony with those around us. Those words that we heard from the first letter of John this morning, they were the very first words I ever translated from my Greek New Testament some 46 years ago this spring. Some higher math involved in calculating that. Those words, we declare to you what was from the beginning, what we have heard, what we have seen with our eyes, what we have looked at and touched with our hands concerning the word of life. These are words about resurrection, words written to bring joy and life and light to the followers of Christ then and now. Resurrection is everywhere. Richard Rohr writes in his book, The Universal Christ, these words: each time we choose to surrender, each time we trust the dying, our faith is led to a deeper level. Each time we decide not to push to the front of the line, something much better happens in the back of the line. Each time we let go of narcissistic anger, we find that we start feeling much happier. Each time we surrender our need to control our partner, the relationship blossoms. Yet each time is a choice, and each time it is a kind of dying. And I might add, and in our dying, a resurrection is born. Theologian Elizabeth Johnson says, and I quote, "The resurrection starts on earth with Jesus dead and buried, and ends up in God with Jesus, the living one, transformed by the power of the Spirit. Alive in God, his presence is no longer bound by earth's limits, but partakes of the omnipresence of God's own love." She continues, "Christ is now present in word and sacrament, and whenever 2 or 3 gather in his name." And then she concludes with this: all explanations aside, resurrection is a truth that has to be lived. A truth that has to be lived. Resurrection is far more than believing that Jesus rose from the dead. The resurrected Christ invites us to experience it and to live lives that breathe the power of the resurrection. The resurrected Christ invites us to let go of the ways of death, the ways of jealousy, the ways of anger, the ways of quarreling, the ways of factions, and to live the life of resurrection, a life filled with love, a life filled with joy, a life filled with peace, a life filled with patience, a life filled with kindness, a life filled with generosity, a life filled with faithfulness, a life filled with gentleness, a life filled with self-control. If those words sound familiar, those words are from Galatians 5, the Apostle Paul's fruit of the Spirit, fruit of the resurrected life. The signs of resurrection are everywhere. 2 years ago, back in April of 2022, I wrote these words: resurrection is in everything I see. Warmth of sun after hibernation of night, blossoming of flowers and leafing of trees, even young fledglings who spread their wings in flight. Warmth of sun after the hibernation of night, rebirth is woven into every living thing, even young fledglings who spread their wings in flight. An epiphany does the cycle of nature bring. Rebirth is woven into every living thing. Death is but a word for regeneration. An epiphany does the cycle of nature bring. All creation is filled with elation. Death is but a word for regeneration. So says the blossoming flowers and leafing trees. All creation is filled with elation. Resurrection is in everything I see. This is the good news of the gospel of the resurrected Christ for all people. Amen?